Hello everybody, this is Tosca from Vijwijk and at Five Oaks Consulting, and this is the second in my interviews with the working title being the series being called Leading with Meaning, where I'm interviewing interesting leaders who have good insights to offer on organizational leadership, whether they're based in the INGO sector or not. And today I'm interviewing Jay Daley. Thank you, Jay, for allowing me to interview you for this short Facebook Live interview. So a little bit about Jay. He's the owner of Tech Obscura, a consulting company that advises organizations on how to become more data-driven organizations. That's my lay head.
Yeah, that's one of the big things.
One of the big things, and we're going to talk a little bit more about what that is. So that's my lay person shorthand. Jay, and that's how I know him, is also a board member of Public Interest Registry, or PIR. In fact, he was recently also acted as its interim CEO. A little bit about Public Interest Registry, because many of you in my audience probably have never heard about this. PIR is the wholesale operator of the .org as well as .ngo domain names that many of us in civil society use for our web presence. And PIR's mission is to provide a safe and trusted internet presence for the 10 million or so customers across the world that buy a .org or .ngo domain name. Many, though not all, I should emphasize that, are nonprofits and NGOs. And 50% or so of the revenue that we raise this way goes to the Internet Society, which is a well-known nonprofit whose mission it is to offer a safe and trusted and accessible internet to all people across the world, which is obviously a very worthy and important mission, because we cannot emphasize enough the incredible importance of the public good, the global good that the internet has become. So the reason, as I said, why I know Jay is because he and I are fellow board members at Public Interest Registry. But the real reason I've asked Jay is because I genuinely admire. You have an acute sense, in my experience and observation, and sense and insights on organizational management, on strategy, and on people in organizations that I admire and want to tap into for this interview. So here we go. So, Jay, as I said to you before we started, in my community of INGOs, most people have very little idea about the incredible infrastructure behind the internet from a technical and an industry perspective, from a commercial perspective. Tell us a little bit more about how your career, to the extent to which your career has moved within that sector. Tell us a little bit more about Tech Obscura does broadly, but also focused on what makes the internet work and the governance of the internet as well.
Sure. I got into this industry accidentally. My eldest child was coming up to school age, and my wife and I wanted to move out of the city, and I ended up getting a job for .uk domain name registry, which, like many of these organisations, is a not-for-profit with a broad range of stakeholders and a complex multi-stakeholder governance arrangement. It was an organisation that was regularly in the news for turmoil and upheaval in its governance, actually, for a number of years. I, after that, emigrated to New Zealand and went to work for .nz, which had a more thought out and developed governance system for the multi-stakeholder governance for a similar organisation that ran .nz and also did work on the internet. And I've, having left that, I've done a number of roles for my own consulting company, working with, again, internet organisations that run critical internet infrastructure, but are all not-for-profits of one form or another, depending on a jurisdiction they formed in, and all have relatively complex multi-stakeholder governance.
And so most of your clients in your current Tech Obscura company are, you said, organizations with a non-profit status there. I had assumed that most of them would be private sector clients,
no, well,
that you span across that.
Yeah, well, they all describe themselves as private sector. So the internet NGO space describes itself as private sector, and has done that for some time to separate it from being a government sector. But yeah, so I do some work for government regulators as well, but largely these are all internet NGOs. Yes.
Oh, interesting. It's really been such an interesting dive for me in the last couple of years. To what extent, given that your career and therefore your insights span across private and sometimes government entities as well as non-profit and NGO entities, mission-based organizations, to what extent do you think leaders in the public, government and non-profit sectors need to think and behave differently in order to be effective than those in the private sector? And to what extent not?
Yeah, I think the key word for me is principles, that organisations and leaders need to be driven by a set of principles. And in the private sector, unfortunately, many organisations have as the top overriding principle, we need to make money. And I think things are changing, obviously. We're seeing organisations begin to realise that we need to add more principles to that. But there's always a suspicion that they'll ditch some of the other principles if that first principle, looks to be in trouble.
Yeah.
In the not-for-profit sector, the NGO space, and increasingly in the public sector, there's a broad range of principles that are public interest principles, that are good principles that these companies are adopting, or these organisations are adopting, and those leaders are then driving and thinking through those. I think that, the challenge we have at the moment is that people aren't generally explicitly understanding that that's the way that the difference is between those organisations, or those nature of those organisations, and so we need to be a little bit better in the not-for-profit sector at very clearly articulating our principles up front for any organisation, and then using that to then control what we do.
So I want to probe a little bit more about, because you emphasize so much principles and principled actors in my sphere of kind of the field of international relations and political science and so on, we would call it like that. So would you say that most NGOs and other mission-based organizations, while they have a set of principles, whether articulately expressed and lived or not, but are at the same time balancing that with being self-interested actors, and with opportunism around it? So how do you see that struggle to balance those two?
I think that the principles that many NGOs have are the principles about the mission that they wish to deliver, rather than necessarily the principles about how they do things. Okay, and I think there are increasingly strong contradictions there in some respects. So I have, and this is anecdotal, I know, but it's relatively common. I have an elderly mother who lives alone, and my mother gives to charities. It's an important thing for her, and she is bombarded with about 8 begging letters per day from different charities. She has managed to get onto a mailing list. Yeah. That's right. And for someone in her position and her thoughts about life and those kind of things, this is intense pressure. This is unreasonably intense pressure. And yet those organisations doing it are ignoring that. They're well aware of it, I'm sure, but they're ignoring that because they're deciding that actually getting the money in order to do the good works over here overrides that. And that's a contradiction that I think we need to resolve.
So that's one example.
Yes, that's right.
One example. That's interesting.
That's right.
Yeah. So fairly frequently, in my experience, leaders in the NGO sphere, particularly in the US it seems, are told that they must emulate business practices with business management, business ways of thinking about strategy and so on. I myself have mixed feelings about this. I definitely see the value sometimes, and sometimes I think it's a kind of a knee-jerk reaction to say everything that the private sector does from an organizational leadership and management perspective is more efficient, more effective, etc. So let me turn that premise on its head. What do you think business leaders can learn from NGO and nonprofit leaders?
A couple of things. I think the principles, as I mentioned earlier, which is vital. The other one is engagement with communities. Many organisations, private sector organisations, are getting themselves into trouble with relationship to a community, and they simply don't understand that their management of their community isn't simply just a transactional thing of customers. It goes beyond that, and they're not. And this is largely part of the role of social media, is that it enables a community to amplify and unite their voice and say something about an organisation. But many of these private sector organisations aren't realising that, and don't have a strategy, and don't have the engagement, and don't have quite often the human warmth in the way that they communicate externally in order to be able to interact with that community properly.
So that is another important factor. Yeah, I'm gonna probe a little bit about strategy. I was struck yesterday in our board meeting how you were quite emphatic about saying you're thinking about strategy, and how you felt that there are certain better ways of going about strategizing and not so good ways. What you observed there, is that something you see more often in our sector, or not, that the way organizations think about strategy is not enough, as you said it, in terms of the what is our current state and what is the state we want to work towards? Or was this a one-off experience?
No, I virtually no organisation I know can do strategy well, and I've seen far too many organisations that have regular periods of discomfort about their strategy, get in a facilitator, go through a strategic process, and end up still not doing strategy. So the strategic process that I outlined isn't mine. I learnt it 20 years ago from a man called David Taylor, who writes books like The Naked Leader. Went to a nice little small masterclass with him, and it's about describing current states and the transformations to new states, or current states that you wish to maintain. Okay? And it's a very important way of thinking about things, because it takes you away from thinking about how you do it underneath it at the strategic level. I mean, you need to do that in your planning, but it encapsulates nicely what a real strategy is about. It is about transformation, it's about change, and it does that. And too many people, I think, can have a conversation, or too many organisations I've seen, can have a great conversation about strategy, but not then encapsulate that or encode that in a way that then really says what they want to achieve, and then can use to drive the business. And so that's why I'm very strongly promoting that way of doing things.
So when you talk about, does your emphasis on current state and the desired state, the change state, if you will, does that also include something that strikes me often in the INGO sphere, that if organizations formulate a strategy and their employees are not able to articulate, to visualize how the changed organization will look like, including for them, in terms of what they will do on a daily basis, not maybe at a granular level, but on a daily, what will be different in that change state, then you haven't done enough to operationalize the strategy.
So I absolutely agree with you. I think sometimes people start by trying to have the vision of the full organisation in change state and then work backwards to the transformations. Some people can do that.
Yeah.
I find it easier to think through each of these transformations to the new states, and then understand what an organisation that has achieved those transformations looks like. And you're absolutely right. It is one way or the other. People are not ending up with that vision of what the organisation is, or they're not starting off with that.
Right. Now, I don't know about the internet sphere, but I will say in my sphere of NGOs, the other thing that I often see lacking is a certain discipline in terms of cascading down, once you have a strategy, what that means for the various units, right? and then down, of course, to the individual person. There is not a discipline in thinking that through.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is that
I think actually that's about the structure of the strategy process that you use quite often. It's simply the semantics, the words that people use don't help drive things enough. And that's why, again, another reason that I prefer, state-based transformations is because it's very clear then what the next level should be. Well, I mean, it may not be, but it's very clear with any proposal of a next level project to address that, whether it will affect one of those states or not. Whereas if you have a more sort of wishy-washy strategy, then anybody can tie almost anything into be supporting that strategy, and that's not, that's not actually sometimes achieving anything.
Right. Yeah, so this was a little bit of digression of the question I wanted to ask you, but I was struck by that conversation, and I thought what you would have to say would be helpful for our audience of INGO leaders. So let's talk a little bit about how you developed your leadership, right? What kind of steps, formal, informal, often probably informal, have you taken to develop yourself to become what you think is a better leader, and what has been its impact?
I'll be quite honest here, that every step upwards I've taken in a hierarchy has come from frustration at the way people are doing that step. And if I had never been frustrated, I would still be a computer programmer as I was 30 years ago. Okay, and it's always been by where I'm not only can I do that better, but I think that I need to do it better because actually the way they're doing it is a problem. So there are a number of different things in there. One of which is about control. Too many people have too much hang up on control.
Yeah.
They're too much driven by control. They're too much. They don't understand it, how it affects them, and the way it drives things internally. And I take first of all, try to avoid having that personal impact on me. Control is simply one mechanism by which you achieve something. Consensus is quite often a far better mechanism of achieving something. So that's one of the things that I've learned, is how to do things differently. Another thing is to be empathetic. There are far too many people who are either too driven or are too, just don't have that empathy personally, or deliberately choose not to have that empathy because they've managed to somehow partition off some of the people that they're meant to be looking after or working with into a group that they feel they can ignore. And so you need to have that empathy, and you need to think right the way across the board with everybody about that empathy. And so I think those are some of the key things. Another thing is best practice, coming out and learning what best practice is and implementing best practice. And a third thing is when you get something wrong, just change it. I mean, as I often say to people, if I make a dreadful mistake at work, then that's not going to affect my ego. It's not the same sort of thing as as any sort of difficulties we have raising children or that kind of stuff. That's far more personal.
Yes.
Yes. That's right. But work is and I know we are committed to work. It's not to say I'm disconnected from it, but we shouldn't let it affect us in that way.
So what you're trying to say is, when you discover you have made, as your words, a dreadful mistake, or you have missed something, or didn't think something through, then what you do is you try to learn from it and move on, leave it behind you.
Well, try not to ignore it.
Yeah.
And certainly, there's some leaders that move on from everything and leave everyone else, really frustrated that they haven't admitted the problem. So no, you have to very clearly understand it, talk through it, sort it out,
and also
take
admit
responsibility.
it.
And take responsibility for cleaning up the mess that you've caused as well. But then you move on. Yes, absolutely. And it shouldn't affect you after done that. Yeah.
Okay. So my last question. This Facebook Live series, my working title for us is Leading with Meaning. So what does leading with meaning imply for you in the technology sector where you operate?
To me, the internet is a hugely powerful means of transforming society. Okay, it's fairly clear that we need. That there are multiple areas where people are subjugated, they are press. There are other things which just deny them basic freedoms. And one of the strong mechanisms for overcoming that is free flow of information, and that is what the internet is providing in many ways.
Except that many governments will
they
therefore
will try.
try.
Oh, absolutely, they will try, but the nature of the internet is that it's extremely difficult for them to do that. And even in some countries which really don't have a functional internet, they have more of a large corporate network, the internet still breaks through at times, and people are still able to do that. And so that to me is absolutely vital, and I think we've seen significant positive impact from the internet over the last 40 years because of what it's enabled people to do. And there are some downsides, and we need to be working on dealing with those downsides. People have learned to exploit the power of the internet for old-fashioned propaganda and things, and we have sort of extremely dangerous things like the anti-vax movement going on, but otherwise it is generally almost entirely a significant force for good. And so that to me in the internet sphere is why so many of us have been in the internet sphere for such a long time, work in NGOs in the internet sphere, and we do roles that are very, very similar to private sector roles, but are far less compensated, for example, and none of us particularly care about that.
Because you're in here intrinsically motivated?
Exactly, because it's doing something that is changing the world and for the better, and that's very useful. And it's a way whereby those of us who are, say, more technically focused and may not necessarily have the ability to, say, change the world at the geopolitical level, can do something that actively changes the world, and so that's good.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, I really enjoyed this interview on many levels. I'll just close by saying you're one of those people who makes me realize again how the internet sphere NGOs, how little they interact, and vice versa, with the others that work on,
that's true,
poverty reduction or gender or environment, etc. And I think it would be so helpful if we had more of these conversations across. There's something about the internet sector, because it's so vast, that it's almost, it has a very strong insularity, and the rest of civil society is kind of not aware of it. And I have personally seen it as, in a small way for myself in the last 3 years, to try to learn more about what the overlapping areas is, and maybe also bring something back to kind of that other big part of civil society.
Right, okay, yes, I can understand that. It is disconnected very much.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for this interview. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Tosca. Thank you.